Hey. So we're talking about Asara B'Teves, the 10th of Teves, and last week we mentioned we brought that it's brought in the Kolboy, and in other places it's attributed as early back. It's brought to Megillas Tanis Basra, and it's attributed as early back as to the time of the Go'anim, that there's this fast on the Kolboy. Yeah, and the fact there's a fast on the 9th of Teves, and our rabbis do not tell us what it's about, and we discussed various different possibilities of what it's all about. One of the ideas that we mentioned was that that the 9th of Teves is the birthday of Yashka, and I want to dive into that a little bit more, and then talk about some other possibilities that are out there. So there is a sefer called Sefer HaIbur. Sefer HaIbur is a very important work written by Rabbi Bar Chiam, who lived he lived a long time ago. He lived like in the 12th century, I think. Say here. Yeah, to 11th and 12th century. Now, Sefer Rabbi Bar Chiam was basically an astronomer. He's like the first person who wrote anything to do with like Torah and science, kind of, obviously in a very ancient way. He was very prominent. The Rambam praises him in his Pirush HaMishnayos. And his book is a very important book. What's interesting about his book is that even though he wrote it as far back as the 11th and 12th century, it wasn't published. I mean, obviously people had manuscripts, but it wasn't published until as late as the 18th or possible 19th century.
When was Gutenberg?
Sorry?
When was the Gutenberg press? They started doing printing.
Printing started in the 14th century, I think. No, 15th.
Okay, sure. So it wasn't printed, but it was 200 years before printing.
It wasn't published. It was never publicly or widely available, even for hundreds of years after the printing press started. Until let's see, I'm trying to see if it says exactly when it was first printed. It was not published until 1851. Okay. Now, Rabbi Mechia was primarily, he was a philosopher, he was an astronomer, he was all sorts of good stuff. But primarily he was known. Sefer Ibur certainly is a book about the calendar. That's what Sefer Ibur means, and he was very good into making calculations and all that stuff. So he made this calculation that in the year 1 of the Common Era, the 25th of December fell on the 9th of Teves. Now, bingo, there you have it. December 25th, the birthday of Eliyahu, matches up with the 9th of Teves. The problem with this is, and Rabbi Sefer Ibur himself points to this problem, he says, I don't really believe that his birthday was on December 25th. And nowadays, we know a lot more about how the December 25th date came about, which we'll talk about in a moment. And besides that, it's also pretty much agreed by all historians, as far as I know, that he actually wasn't born in the year 1 BCE. I think some say he was born in the 2nd, and 2, and 3, and 6. There's all different opinions of exactly when he was born, but it wasn't 2022 years ago. So exactly how that the Georgian or Julian calendar started counting from 1 and how that came about, but it certainly wasn't to do with his birth. And so this kind of pops a hole into the whole theory that Tes Teves is the birthday of Eliyahu. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I'll reference, if you want somebody who talks about this at great length, about the history of December 25th, there is a rabbi, a shliach in Florida by the name of Pinchas Taylor. He's written a number of books. Some of his books we have in the library here. And a couple of years ago, he did a whole talk on the history of Mittelnacht and December 25th. And he really goes through it with he has all the historical sources. It's on YouTube. Google Pinchas Taylor, December 25th, you'll find it. Ask me for the link if you can't find it. Anyway, But the source to suggest that Yoshka was born in Tastevis is basically from the Sefer Ibor, and he himself pokes a hole into the whole theory, and he says it doesn't seem to be. He says, I'll read you his words. He says, "Ein adam mamin divrayim." I don't believe their words that they say that his that he was born on B'chaf Hey Daikper, which is 25th of December. Ki hadavar hazeh einu kasuv lahem ba'ongoloyon. Anybody know what ongoloyon is? It's a word that's found in the Gemara also. Think of the Hebrew letters over here. Aleph Vav Nun Gimel Lamed Yud Vav Nun. It means the New Testament. Evangelical. It's the same word as evangelical. Yeah. Okay. It doesn't say anywhere in the New Testament that he was born on December 25th. And in fact, apparently, I don't know. Maybe you know, Timothy. Apparently it talks about his birth being associated with springtime or certain things going on in the fields or whatever. There's different theories amongst Christians, historians of exactly, some say he was March, and there's all different dates of his birth. None of the historical dates seem to point to anywhere near December 25th. And he says actually the 25th of December was a Yom Koloin, a day of Koloin means of degradation, but it means like it was a day of celebration to the Gentiles for the pagans, yeah, the Ivdei Alilim, for many years, and it was called the birth of the year and the birth of the sun, and because that's the time when the sun started getting right. You just passed the equinox, and now the days are getting longer, so the sun is getting stronger. So it was all connected to and basically what he's essentially saying, and again, you listen to this talk from Pinchas Taylor, which I listened to a while ago. It's basically clear that, and I'll show you the sources for this in the Gemara, that actually the holiday of December 25th, as well as the holiday of New Year's, yeah, are basically very, very, very ancient pagan days of celebration, celebrated by breaking all rules. Enough said for a record, right? And this has been going on for millennia. And the Christians decided to make this, instead of abolishing the pagan holidays, celebrations, they just transformed them into religious ones. And they said, okay, this is the new year, and this is the birth, and it's all good, right? Now, the history of this, and as far as from the Gemara, is fascinating, because in the beginning of the Gemara of Avodah, it talks about not doing business with the idolaters around on the day and 3 days prior to their Yemei Dehen, to their pagan holidays, right? And the Gemara talks about the Mishnah mentions 3 holidays: Kalanda, yeah, exactly pronounce it, Kuf Lamed Nun Daled Aleph, Satar Nura, and Yom Genusia. So first of all, the Gemara says, what are these days? Kaladna and Satar Nura. So Reb Chanan bar Rabbi says that Kaladna is 8 days after the Tkufa, after the equinox, and Satar Nura is 8 days before the equinox. And basically those are days that they celebrated. Now, we know, yeah, pagans, they're very into the sun and the moon and the right, so it makes sense that they would have celebration of days around the equinox, right? The day is getting longer now. It's the sun god, not the S-O-N, the S-U-N god, right? And so this source sheet is actually from a very interesting website, Rabbi Manning. I think it's rabbimanning.com. Yeah, he's actually a British rabbi. I think he lives in Israel. He's always got good stuff. So he brings here I'll read you his footnotes here, right? Kalends, the Mishnah says kalend. Kalends was a Roman name for the new moon, hence the English word calendar. Interestingly, the Roman Saturnalia and Kalends festival were accompanied by drinking, etc., singing naked in the streets, giving gifts, and the general relaxing of legal rules. Okay, now that's the first one the Mishnah says. Then the Mishnah says Saturnura. He says some texts of the Mishnah read Saturnalia, which is the name of the Roman solstice festival, which held during the days leading up to the solstice and culminating with the birth of the unconquerable sun on December 23rd. Right? The Tiferes Yisrael suggests that the Tiferes Yisrael is a commentary of the Mishnah. he suggests that the name of it was changed purposely to some text from Saturnalia to Saturnalia, which means the light is on the side, in order not to mention the name of a pagan god, Saturn. Right? We actually discussed a few months ago about, are you even allowed to say the name of the planets? Because, Saturn is the name of a planet, but actually it comes from pagan, right?
Jupiter, Mars, Venus.
Right, the days of the week also. Anyway, we discussed that a few months ago. We gave a class. I think we did a class on that, right? Yeah. Okay. And it's fascinating to see how these the Gemara talks about these days, and the Gemara clearly mentions how these days are a week before and a week after the solstice or the equinox, whatever it is, and the equinox, right? And I forget which one is which, but basically they had December. On there because somehow we lost connection, but because you stayed on, the recording did not get interrupted. All right. Okay. So and basically the other Harishan instituted them, and then they were later taken and by the pagans into these days of just letting loose. It says like this: Adam Harishan saw that the days were getting shorter, and he said, "Woe is to me! Perhaps," this is the Gemara in Asara, "perhaps it's because of my sin of eating from the tree that Hashem said He's going to give me death. Maybe this is the death. You see, the days are getting shorter and shorter." And so he sat Amad v'yashav ches yom b'tanis v'tefillah. He was for 8 days. He was fasting and praying. Then he saw that he came to Tkufas Teves, to the where the days started getting longer. And he's like, "Oh, this is not my avera. This is the minhag shel olam. This is how it works." And therefore, he made an 8-day celebration. So before the tkufa, he had an 8-day fasting, followed by 8-day of celebration. And the next year, he made those 8 days into a Yom Tov, right? So think about the 8 days around the tkufa, around the birth of the sun. December 25th, 8 days till January 1st, marked by Xmas and New Year's. This is clearly has a history that goes way back to the pagans, way back to Adam Harishan, and has nothing to do historically with the birth of Yashka. So this whole theory, which was really exciting, and it really added up, because if Yashka was born on the 9th of Teves, then it makes sense why Chazal wouldn't tell us why we're fasting, because that wouldn't go down so well. So, right? So what are we going to do with this? So there's actually another fascinating suggestion, and thank you, Yaakov, for pointing my attention to it. Before that, I should mention also there's one important source that I did not come across last week, but it's Sefer Kabbalah L'Haravid. Sefer Kabbalah L'Haravid, there's a number of Ravids. Perhaps the most famous Ravid is the Ravid who has his glasses on the Rambam. And I think he's the third or the second. He's the third Ravid, and he lived in Provence in 1125 to 1198. Provence is in France, so that's the third Ravid. The first Ravid lived born 1110 to 1180, so 12th century in Spain, and he has a book called Sefer Kabbalah, and he says we know there was a very prominent Jew in Spain called Reb Shmuel HaNogid. I don't know all the history, but I understand that he was basically the prime minister of Spain, and he was a very famous Jew. And so Sefer Kabbalah Rabbi writes as follows: that he had a son who Al-Kana, I don't know if it means he was his successor or he helped him, was his right hand man. His name was Rabbi Yosef HaNogid, and he had all the tremendous virtues that his father had, except he wasn't an anvasan like his father. He wasn't as humble as his father. Why? Why wasn't he humble? Because he grew up in wealth and he never carried any burdens. He never had any trouble. He never had to work hard for anything. So he became very haughty, and because he was haughty, the Sarni Plishtim were jealous of him. Now, Sarni Plishtim can't be literal because there's no Plishtim in Spain, but it means that the local Goyim were jealous of him, and he was killed on the Shabbos on the 9th of Teves in the year 4,860. 4,860 corresponds to, somebody do the math. Now we're almost 1,000 years ago, just less than 1,000 years ago. Yeah, and he says that this is why they instituted a fast on the 9th of Teves, and this is also why they didn't tell us what it was for, because it hadn't yet happened. It was instituting a fast for something that was going to happen in the future. Mm-hmm. The Rabbi mentioned this Sefer Kabbalah. This is
why do you keep saying 9th of Teves?
Because that's what we're talking about. The Megillah Tammuz, we talked about this last week. Megillah Tammuz says
10.
No, no, it's the 9th of Teves. There are 3 days. We said there's a fast on the 8th day, on the 9th day, and the 10th day of Teves. And the 8th of Teves was that they translated the Torah, which we incorporate that in our Slichas, the 10th of Teves. The 9th of Teves, right? Mm-hmm. So he says that it was made for the future because there was going to be this terrible pogrom where Rabbi Yosef HaNagid was killed. There's a famous chapter in Shalos Teshuvos Min HaShamayim. Shalos Teshuvos Min HaShamayim is a response. We've discussed this also at length. Is a response written by one of the Balei HaTosfos where he would ask questions and have a revelation at night with answers to his question. And one of the answers to his question, it says that Yud-Tes Kislev, he asked the question on Yud-Tes Kislev, and before they answered his question, they told him that today is a Yom Besura, today is a day of good news, there's more. There's like a line or two there about the significance of Yud-Tes Kislev. So what's special about Yud-Tes Kislev? Hundreds of years later, Yud-Tes Kislev became a Yom Besura. So I didn't look this up, but if someone told me that the Rebbe was once talking on Yud-Tes Kislev about this Shalos Teshuvos Min HaShamayim, and the Rebbe said, those are the people who are uncomfortable with how could it be that Shalos Teshuvos Min HaShamayim, it says something about the future, that Yud-Tes Kislev is a Yom Besura, or something that happened hundreds of years later. The Rebbe said that the Ravid says the same thing. The Ravid says that Chazal instituted a fast on the 9th of Teves for a pogrom that was going to happen hundreds of years later. Now, I did actually see online, saw some people raising eyebrows about this, but there's another source that I found, which we're going to talk about this source more later, but this is a much more classical source, which is the Tashbitz. The Tashbitz is Tzemach ben Duran, I think. Very important.
Hammer of the Ran?
Possibly, you could Google it. Very, very important Pesach, philosopher. Yeah. Very, very important work. Tashbitz. His most famous sefer is his Shalos Teshuvos Tashbitz, but he wrote many others for him as well. And we're going to see this part of his tshuva later in the class when we talk about Asara B'Teves. But part of the question with Asara B'Teves is why is the fast on the 17th of Tammuz when the pasuk indicates that the walls to Jerusalem were actually breached on the 9th of Tammuz? So we're going to discuss this later, but one thing that the Tashbitz says is Shekach kivnu hanaviyim beruach hakodesh shebeshniya tiboka ha'ir b'yud zayin b'Tammuz, that the prophets perceived with ruach hakodesh, with prophecy, that the second time round for the second temple, 500 years from now, the 500 years after the destruction of the first temple, give or take, the wall would be breached on the 17th of Tammuz, and therefore, for knowing with their foresight, with their Ruach HaKodesh, that for many, many years the Jews would be fasting, commemorating the breach of the wall, they decided it would be more appropriate to fix it on a day which would be, to us, the most recent breach of the wall on the 17th of Tammuz rather than the 9th of Tammuz. I haven't seen others quoting this source in this context, but I think it's a very important source because the Tashbitz is a very prominent Pasuk, and again, like I said, I heard somebody who I won't say his name, but somebody who said, "Oh, Sefer Kabbalah, arrive at the comment that's ridiculous. They instituted the fast because it's something pogrom into it. It doesn't make any sense." But you see, the Tashbitz is certainly open to that idea of Chazal with the Ravim instituting a fast because of something that's going to happen in the future. Okay, now before we move on to the next thing, in the very same Gemara, there's a very strange Rashi, which we'll see later is only part of the Rashi, but this is the way the Rashi is printed in the Gemara. The Gemara says that again, most of what I'm saying today is coming from RabbiManning.com, and Rabbi Manning is getting it from Shnei Lyman or something, but I've also added in some other sort of the way I processed it, I guess. All right, so he says, I just want to sort of give credit where credit's due. All right, so the Gemara says the third, we had the Kalends and Saturnalia, and then the Gemara says Yom Genusia. What's Yom Genusia? So the Gemara says that Yom Genusia is the day when they coronate a king. Frag the Gemara, how could the same Genusia means the day that they coronate a king? Surely there's a brisa which enumerates Genusia and the day that they coronate a king. So it can't be that Genusia means coronation of a king if there's a brisa that system is two separate occasions. And the Gemara says no. One is when they when they coronate the father as a king, and one is when they coronate the successor, the son as a king. So the Gemara, okay, the Gemara says, do the Romans coronate children? They don't have. They have the how do you call it, the Caesar, which is set in by a vote by the Senate. They don't have hereditary that the king the Caesar dies and his son succeeds him. So how could it mean? How could you say that Yom Genusia means the day where the son is put in place as leader in place of his father? The Romans don't even do that, and I guess the assumption is that the Mishnah is talking about the Romans. Right, and to back this up, he says, he brings a pasuk from Avadia where it says in Nikotinus Aticha B'Goyim. Now Avadia's nevuah is about Edom, and Edom in Chazal is always associated with the Romans. Right? So Kotinus Aticha B'Goyim, I have made you. The pasuk says, I have made you small amongst the nations. Bozi Atim Oid, you are very bozui. How would you translate bozui? Very humiliated, very, very degraded. Let's see how the Rabbi Article translates it. Avadia. How many chapters are in the book of Avadia? Does anybody know? One. Yeah. There's one chapter, and it's the Haftarah. We just read it a few weeks ago. And where is it? Pasuk 2, right at the beginning. Yeah. Behold, I have made you inferior amongst the nations. You are very despised. So, what are these two things? How are they how are they inferior, and how are they despised? The Gemara says they are inferior because in Meshiva Melech ben Melech, they don't have the hereditary monarchy, and Bozi Yatim Oid Sheinam Ksav Veloshin, they don't have a script or a language. The Romans don't have a script and a language. That's what the Gemara says. The whole discussion about the Melech ben Melech, I'm not going to get into. They don't have a constitution? Okay. Listen to what Rashi says. Rashi says, Ksav Veloshin, they don't have a script or language. Shall Romium, the Ksav Veloshin shall Romium, the script and the language of the Romans, came to them from another nation. So again, I don't know exactly the history of Latin and Greece and whatever. Yeah, basically they don't have their own alphabet. Okay, fine. And then Rashi adds 4 words. Others fixed for them or wrote for them all of their books. The Romans don't have any books. That's what Rashi seems to be saying. Right? So what does that even mean? Of course, the Romans do have many books. And in Rabbi Manning even puts the footnotes, the names of the books, which I can't pronounce. And right, but obviously the Romans have many books. What does it mean that they didn't write any books? And why is Rashi even saying that? How does that come in? How is that relevant to this Gemara that they don't have the script in the language where other people write them up?
It's like everything that they do is pretty much borrowed from other cultures, right?
Okay.
Language and
Okay.
even the destruction of the base of Migdash, they got that from Babel.
Right, exactly. All right. Now
they have nothing to offer really.
Now, so we're going to see soon that actually this Rashi is censored. It was cut up because of the censor, but we do have from the what's it called the Tukei Sofrim the full text of Rashi. But before we get to the full text of Rashi, we're going to get to the final theory about the fast of the 9th of Tammuz. So there is a manuscript. We don't know what this manuscript is. It's quoted anonymously by Rabbi Frankel. Rabbi Frankel Ta'imim, most famous for his glosses to the Shulchan Aruch, Hagos Baruch Frankel, Hagos Baruch Tam. He wrote other things also. He writes, Matzasi b'ksav yad, I found in a manuscript, Shates Teves niftar Shimon HaKalpus, that Shimon HaKalpus died on the 9th of Teves. Sheishia Yisrael Mitzara Gedela, he saved the Jewish people from a great tzara, from great trouble. Zman HaParitzim, in the time of Paritzim, I think in this context, Zman HaParitzim means in the time of the early Christians. Nikva Yom Misosi Latanis Olam b'Yerushalayim, and in Jerusalem, the day of his passing was fixed as an eternal fast. Okay, so we have this anonymous manuscript, talks about some ambiguous Shimon HaKalpos who saved the Jewish people from some unnamed tzara, and somehow associated Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem his day of his passing was fixed as a fast, and that's the 9th of Tammuz, and that could perhaps help us understand. I mean, it's not just Jerusalem. It's a Sefer Tanis in the Megillas Tanis Basra. It talks about. By the way, I made a mistake last week. Last week I said that Megillas Tanis is a very early pre-Tanaic work, which is true, but this is not Megillas Tanis. This is Megillas Tanis Basra, which is a later work, but still a very, very important work. So
wait a second. The 9th of Tammuz is the day that they didn't really specify, right? What happened that day?
Correct.
That's the 9th.
Correct. Now, then we have a similar comment brought here from the Ma'ira of Rabbi Aaron of Vermeiser. Vermeiser's Worms. Rabbi Aaron Vermeiser was the successor and student of the famous Shaigus Arya, chief rabbi of Metz. Okay, Metz, I think, Vermeiser, I think they're close to each other. Anyway, so he writes similarly, Tanis Tes B'Teves, V'Sefer Zichronos, in some historical book, Sefer Zichronos, a book of history. Ro'isi, I saw al Patiras Shimon HaKalponi, here before he was Shimon HaKalpos, now he's Shimon HaKalponi, Shehishlim Yehudim, Ve'elimim Mipneim, he had peace with the Jews, or he did something for the Jews, and it was hidden from them. Don't say who them is. And it makes sense because in Megillas Tanis it says that the rabbis didn't tell us what it was about. So it makes sense that it should be connected with this Shimon HaKalponi, because if it was him, then it makes sense that the Megillas Tanis would be afraid to tell us what it's about. Okay, so we have him called Shimon HaKalponi, Shimon HaKalpus. Who is this guy? What's he all about? So there is a book which has never been widely published, and for understandable reasons, and it's called Toldos Yeshu, which is a Jewish version of the history of Yeshu HaNotzi, of the founder of Christianity, I guess, right? Now, because it's sort of never been widely published, and there's also versions of it, and all sorts of manuscripts of it, so it's like, it's difficult to quote anything from there reliably, and some things are found in one version and not in the other. But we'll see soon that it's clear that both Rabbi Vermeiser and the Baruch Frankel, talking about this history book or this manuscript, which talks about the 9th of Tammuz being the passing of Shimon HaKalpos or Shimon HaKalponi, is referring to this book, Toldos Yeshu HaNotzi. Now, in Toldos Yeshu HaNotzi, it said, oh, now there's one version, one second. Okay. So in Sefer in Tammuz it says that there was a big problem with the early Christians because the early Christian. I mean, if you think about it in more recent history, you have the same problem with Sabbatianism, by Shabtai Tzvi, where you had all these people who were part of the community. They were from the Shem Shabbos. They came to shul. They davened with the minyan, talis, tefillin, the whole thing, but they had the Shabtai Tzvi, right? They believed in Shabtai Tzvi, and without getting the whole history of Shabtai Tzvi, eventually that kind of fizzled out, right? You had the same problem with the early Christians. They were regular Jews doing all the mitzvahs and doing all this, they were in shul with everybody else, kind of thing. But
Maybe
they believed in Yashka, right? So the Talmud Yeshua said that the sages decided they wanted to sort of get the Christians away. So they sent this person who's called in Talmud Yeshua, not is referred to as Shimon Kafir, right? Shimon HaKalponi or something like that. And he brings here, right? And basically they sent him to infiltrate Christianity. And he basically pretended to be a Christian and he changed loads of things. He says, okay, we're not going to do Shabbos on Saturday, we're going to do it on Sunday. We're not going to do, instead of the New Year, we'll do this. Instead of this, we'll do, he changed all the holidays.
Paul.
Yeah, we'll get there. There's two people. There's Peter and Paul. I'm not sure who they are.
I mean, this would more fit in Paul's writing.
Okay, well, we'll see soon.
Turn it away from the mitzvahs.
Yeah, basically, he turned them away from the mitzvahs, and therefore, this was like now there was a clear divide. These are Christians, these are Jews, and never the twain shall meet. He brings in the footnote here. It says the classical records of Eusebius, whatever, show that Simon, son of Colopas, was a Jewish Christian leader and was bishop of Jerusalem from the year 70 to 107. So basically, this Shimon HaKalpis is the bishop of Jerusalem, right? That's why it was a Megillas Tanis. That's why it was a fast in Jerusalem. And he was the bishop of Jerusalem, but really, he was a Jew who was doing all these things to...
Wait, in what
era?
era?
One second. This is in the year 70 to 107, it says.
So contemporaries with those two, Peter and Paul.
Yeah. Maybe it wasn't either of them. Maybe it was a third. Maybe there was Shimon, Peter, and Paul. I don't know exactly. Well, one second. There's going to be more in a minute. So, all these new. Okay. Again, the problem here is that there's different versions of Teredos Yeshua. So some versions seem to say that Shimon is Paul. Some people say it was in addition to Paul. Whatever it is. Now, there's one version of Teredos Yeshua, which he calls here the Huldreich version. And over there it says that this Shimon HaKalpos, he resided in the Tower of Rome. He codified Christian laws and customs. And it says there, he transformed the alphabet, giving the letters new names, thereby intimating to those in on the secret that what he ordained was false. The alphabet was A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. I'm reading from some translation. Anyway. He also composed for them books of lies, which he called Avon Kelion, the New Testament. But they thought he said Evangelium, right? So he said Avon Kelion, which I guess is supposed to mean lies or something. And
Avon Kelion, right?
Oh, Avon Kelion. There you go. The sin of destruction. And then that Avon Kelion became Evangelium. called Schneier Lyman or something like that. Yeah. So Schneier Lyman, I found the recording where Schneier Lyman talks about this. It's not a very clear recording, so it was hard to think. So Schneier Lyman says, like, he never believed any of these This is like not like this doesn't make any sense. But then he found the original, because this is, again, I don't know all the historical references that he's saying there, but he basically says that when he found the Diktuke Seifrim, the original version of this Rashi that I quoted before, it's clear that Rashi is quoting this version of Teilus Yeshu HaNotzri, where it says that he gave them their ABC, that he wrote all the books. Remember, they don't have their own books. Right? Which books is he talking about? He's talking about the books in the New Testament, John and who knows the names? Yeah, does he have it? John, Matthew. Yeah, he writes. I think he writes here. Hold on, I might have the names here in English. Hold on. What's the original text of the Rashi?
Right. That's a later one.
That's a later.
Anyway, this is the original text of Rashi, the way the Ketukei Seifrim has it. It says, other people fix for them not all their books, all the Sifrei Ta'usam, all the books of their mistakes, in other words, of their heresy. Yochanan, which is John, Paulus, Petrus, what are those? Is there a book of called Paul and Peter?
Well, they were the writers.
Matthew and this and that.
Yeah, like Corinthians is written by Paul for sure.
V'hem Yehudim hayu. Rashi, this is Rashi talking. They were Jews. What does it mean? The Gemara says that they don't have their own language. Loshen, it says Rashi, Loshen hu grammatica. Loshen means grammar. Hu Loshen shemedam b'Galachim, which is the language which the priests talk. V'hem shinu v'nomko Loshen v'aslem hevel. They, meaning those Jews, changed for them the language and made it be nonsense. The chashram, if they answer them in order that they should become separate, to remove them from the Jewish people. They themselves were not heretics. They were doing it for the good of they intended to do it for the good of the Jewish people. Because they saw the Jewish people suffering because of the, I'm not sure what that word means, because of something to do with Yeshu. Also, they pretended as if they were with Jesus in the holiness. And they gave all these commandments. As all this is explicit, the Sipur Kliyas Yeshu in the book, or the story of Kliyas Yeshu, which is probably a reference to Toldos Yeshu. So Rashi clearly had a version of this book called Toldos Yeshu, which incorporated within it that this Shimon HaKalpais, or not Shimon, he doesn't mention the word, Rashi doesn't actually mention the word Shimon HaKalpais, but that Paul and Peter and all the, he says, John, Paul, Peter, that they were Jews who went in, who infiltrated Christianity and had a big part in giving them new ABCs, writing books of the New Testament and making them not keep mitzvahs, to move away from Judaism, and so so B'meila, that's the l'chayra. It seems that's the pshat in the Megillas Tanis Basra, and again, I'm happy to provide anybody the link to Rabbi Manning or to Professor, what's his name again?
Layman.
Professor Shneur Layman.
He thinks this is possible, Layman.
Layman, well, whether or not he believes what it says in Toldos Yeshu, I don't know. I didn't think, but he does believe that this is an accurate version of the original Toldos Yeshu. He says the fact that it's quoted by Rashi, the fact that it's quoted by Rashi means that this is actually what it says in Toldos Yeshu, even though nowadays we only have it in one version of Toldos Yeshu, but that's what Chazal probably meant.
But not necessarily this theory that
whether Shneur Layman believes that Peter and Paul were really infiltrator, probably not. But I have no idea. Right? Okay. Then he goes on a little bit to Nittelach. Okay, we're going to leave that for now. All right. Now, one more thing which I wanted to get back to, which I mentioned last week, and then move on to Asara B'Teves, is so last week I mentioned that the Bnei Yissaschar says that the fact that Chazal made Tisha B'Av into the fast, even though the main destruction happened on the 10th of Av, is because the beginning, the temple, it was set on fire on the 9th, and the beginning is what counts. So Bnei Yissaschar associates that with the fast of Asara B'Teves, where you see that the beginning of the downfall is what counts. So I saw this week on the Shalom Meshiv. Shalom Meshiv was the Rav, the Lemberger, who's the Rav of a city called Lvav. Also, it's Lemberg, the Lemberger Rav. And Yosef Shal Nathanson wrote very important Shalom Meshiv. So he also says the same thing that Asara B'Teves, both by Asara B'Teves and Tisha B'Av, you see that the important stage to mark practice mourning is by the beginning of the destruction. Now, last week I mentioned that Rashi says explicitly in the Mishnah that on his commentary to the Mishnah Megillah that if Asara B'Teves were to fall on Shabbos, it would be postponed, and we said that doesn't seem to fit with Abu Darham. The Shalom Meshiv wants to synthesize between Rashi and Abu Darham, and he comes up with a genius idea. He says, Rashi's commenting on the Mishnah. Now the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah that during the 70 years of Galus Bavel, they would fast on these 4 fasts. But then in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the fasts were not practiced. And then later they were reinstated. But the Gemara says there were 2 stages in the reinstating the fast. The first stage was that it was an optional fast, Rotzim Misanin, Rotzim Misanin. And then later, when it became a time of more troubles, and then also for us, it was Kibla Aleim Kechayva. Nowadays the fasts are mandatory. Right?
Wait.
The fasts of Asara B'Teves. The pasuk refers
9, 10, 11.
No. The fast of the 4th month, 5th month, 7th month, and 10th month of Tammuz, of Tishrei, Teves. Right? Those 4 fasts, which nowadays are obligatory to fast. There was a time during the Second Temple or after the Second Temple when those fasts were optional. Says the Shalom Meshiv, Rashi is commenting on the Mishnah. Mishnah Megillah. Mishnah Megillah says that if Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbos, it's pushed off. So Rashi says not just Tisha B'Av, all of the fasts. The Mishnah is written at the time when those fasts are optional. So obviously, if the fast is optional and it falls on Shabbos, we're going to push it off. We're not going to fast on Shabbos, an optional fast. But that doesn't necessarily contradict Abu Darham, who says that nowadays, when the fasts are obligatory, if it were to fall on Shabbos, it would override Shabbos. So that was just a very interesting way to synthesize between the two which is born from the Shalom Meshiv. It's fascinating. He starts off. He goes from one thing to the other. The shaila that he's addressing is that the government made a law that it's illegal to get married under the age of 21, under the age of 20. And so the question is that according to Torah, you have to get married when you're 18. So do they have, what should they do? Right? It's interesting because you have in the, certainly in some extreme places, perhaps even in some not so extreme places, where Jewish communities where they would like their children to get married before the age that it's legal to marry in whatever country they're in. And it's a question, whatever. Anyway, we're not going to get into that. Okay.
It's a question of
Meaning if
the Mafusa Dina.
well, I don't know if it's actually a question of Dina Malchus Dina. I guess the question is to what lengths do you go to get married at the age that you think Torah wants you to get married if it's illegal, right? You do because you can get in big trouble with the law, right? So do you have to go for Messias Nefesh? Okay, whatever. It's a topic for another time. All right.
Sounds like an easy thing to pull off. Like you get halakhically married, you just don't get legally married. But I don't know how some of these countries work. Like here in the United States, it would be pretty easy to pull something. Like, let's say 2 16-year-olds get married. Right.
But the
So
question is,
that's illegal technically.
no, but what
They're
if
not
it's
officially married.
what if it's an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old?
That would be considered Well, that
would be
might-
more
I'm not-
probably.
that would be considered statutory rape.
Right. So,
Even if it's consensual, it's not considered consensual.
anyway, all right. Now, So here's
Oh, really? If the parents allow it.
okay. Now we're going to move on. We have only about 10 minutes or so left. I want to touch upon this, an interesting thing. The Gemara, the pasuk says. So we have here, Steve. The Mishnah says that we fast on the 17th of Tammuz, and for 5 reasons. One of the reasons is that that is when the wall was breached. Right now, the problem is that if you look in the pasuk in Yirmiyah, in chapter 52, it says. 52:6. And in the 4th month and the 9th day of the month, which is the 9th of Tammuz, that's when the wall was breached, right? And people said, etc. It's a whole story, right? So what are we to do with this? And the Mishnah says that the wall was breached on the 17th of Tammuz, and the pasuk says that it was breached on the 9th of Tammuz. So, what?
I think I saw something very interesting about this once.
Okay. So.
You
But
might be saying it.
yeah, okay. Okay, so but Pashtus was the Machlokus Bavdi in Yerushalmi. The Gemara asks this question, the Babylonian, they call it the TB, they call it, yeah, Talmud Bab, yeah, in the academic articles, it's called TB, I think, or BT or TB. Anyway, yeah. The Gemara says, Bavdi says that in the destruction of the first temple described in the book of Yirmiyah, they breached the wall on the 9th of Tammuz, and in the destruction of the second temple, which is what the Mishnah is referring to, we fast on the 17th of Tammuz. Now we have to understand, why should that be the case? Why should we fast? Why would we be fasting more for the second temple than for the first temple? And by the way, with the fast of Asara B'Teves, it's the other way around. We fast on the day that they besieged Jerusalem the first time, when the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem, not when the Romans besieged Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right? So one second, we'll get to that. On the other hand, the Yerushalmi asks the same question, the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Yerushalmi says, Kilkul Cheshbonis Yeshkan. There was a mix-up. There's a mix-up of the dates. What does it mean that there was a mix-up of the dates? So the common way of understanding it, and this is what the Karban Aida says this in his on the page in the Yerushalmi, and this is also stated by Tosfos. I don't remember exactly where the Tosfos is. Yeah, Tosfos is in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Ches. Tosfos says that basically because of all the confusion and everything that was going on over there, that they had to kill. They partially mixed up with the dates. They got the dates a few weeks off. What?
Who mixed it up? The Mishnah or the Pasuk?
No, the Jews at the time. The Jews at the time that really. So essentially, what the way Tosfos is understanding it is that actually both by the first temple and the second temple, it actually occurred on the 17th of Tammuz.
Right.
But the Jews at the time were all confused that they thought it was on the 9th of Tammuz. And so the pasuk, they didn't want to sort of get them confused even more. So they said, okay, you think it's the 9th of Tammuz, it's on the 9th of Tammuz.
Right. So not the Navi himself.
No, not that the Navi's confused.
But the Navi allowed something that was actually false to be written down.
Yes, the Navi allowed the mistake to be.
That's what I find.
Yes, the Navi allowed the
That's
mistake.
what you were going to say. I saw something interesting once about this.
Yeah.
I was like, when I saw this, I was like, what in the world is going on?
Right. Now,
but we had the same thing in this parsha. That what the brothers told Yosef wasn't true.
yes.
About what Yaakov told them, and yet the Torah put it down. That a false statement.
And so this is classically always presented as a machlokas. The Bavli holds that the first temple was in the first destruction, the wall was breached on the 9th of Tammuz, and the second temple on the 17th. And the Yerushalmi holds that both were on the 17th, but the first time around the Jews were all confused and they thought it was on the 9th, and the Navi sort of went with that. The Turei Even says in his commentary to Rosh Hashanah, he says that actually the Bavli agrees with the Yerushalmi. The Bavli. Basically, what he's saying is that the Bavli holds that One second. He says it can't be that the first temple it was destroyed on the 9th, because then we would fast on the 9th, like you see by Asara B'Teves, that we fast mainly for what happened by the first destruction. Why do we fast for what happened by the first destruction? So it all goes back to what we were talking about before, that the beginning is always the most important thing, right? The beginning of the downfall. Asara B'Teves, Tishba was the beginning, and like the Mefarshim point out, that the second temple wasn't a complete recuperation. There was Chamisha Dvarim Chosur. There were 5 things that were missing in the second temple. They didn't have the divine inspiration responding in the Cheshon, in the Tumim. They didn't have the Aron, etc. 5 things missing. So at the end of the day, the first destruction till today has never been, until the building of the third Beis Hamikdash, has never been replenished. Restored. So he says nervous then. So he says, but we fast on the 17th of Tammuz, because really that's when it happened. That's when it happened in both Beis Hamikdash. Like the Yerushalmi holds, that it really happened on the 17th, and we fast on, and the 9th is just a mistake. So he says like this: why does, because there's a certain severity to Tisha B'Av, because Huchbula Asaris. That because the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed both the first time and the second time in Tisha B'Av, Huchbula Asaris therefore has a severity that you always have to fast with the whole Gemara Shon in different times, like we said before. So he said, according to this, Asara B'Teves is also Kilkul Cheshbonos Yeshkan. Sorry, is also Huchbula Asaris. Sorry, yeah. Asara B'Teves also, if you say that in the first Beis Hamikdash, the wall was also breached on the 17th of Tammuz, so Asara B'Teves also should have that severity that Tisha B'Av has. So he says no, because the Navi himself allowed the mistake to be perpetuated, didn't want to confuse them even more, and he allowed it to remain to be on the 9th of Tammuz. So therefore, the Mishnah doesn't count it to be as a Huchbula Atzaros. Because the Mishnah also allowed, if the Navi allowed them to keep the mistake, so we'll also allow them to keep the mistake. The point being that the main point of the Torah Evan is that you see that he's not comfortable with this being a Machlokes Bavli Yerushalmi, and he's trying to bring them together. Now, we're going to see in a minute another interesting way to bring the Bavli and the Yerushalmi together. The Marsha is also, so there's a Marsha in Tanis, the end of Tanis, Marsha. So he gets into this whole thing about why we're fasting for the second temple and not for the first temple. And then he says that he brings us Yerushalmi of Kilkul Cheshbonos. And he says, what does Kilkul Cheshbonos mean? He says, Kilkul Cheshbonos doesn't mean they made a mistake. There's no mistake. What it says, one of the decrees of the Babylonians, on the Jewish people, was against the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. They weren't allowed to keep the Jewish calendar. So they, instead of having Kiddush HaChodesh and keeping our lunar calendar, we were doing like the Goyim were doing, the Goyim counting the solar calendar. Now, what's the difference between the solar calendar and the lunar calendar in a year? 11 days, right? The 11 day difference. Now, he says like this. If there's 11 days difference in the whole year, then how much is the difference from the beginning of the year until Tammuz, which is 3 seasons? It's 8 days, right? So it's not that Kilkul Cheshbonos means that they made a mistake. Kilkul Cheshbonos means that because of the decree against using the lunar calendar effectively, they were on a solar calendar, which was 8 days ahead. And therefore it was the 9th of the Tammuz according to the solar count, which is the 17th of the Tammuz according to the lunar count. Right? That's what the Marsha says. And then the Marsha goes into this whole thing about how the significance of the non-Jews counting for the sun by the sun and the Jews counting by the moon. Now, based on this Marsha, the Rabbi points out that, again, according to the Marsha, we can say that actually there is no machlokes. I mean, the Marsha doesn't say this explicitly, but it's kind of what he's saying, yeah? that there's no machlokas Bavli in Yerushalmi over here. The Yerushalmi is saying that it happened on the 7th, that it's on the 17th, and it was on the 9th of Tammuz, because that's the day they recorded in the Navi. And the Yerushalmi is explaining that it's Kilkul Chashmonos. The Navi doesn't mean to say that it happened on the 9th of Tammuz on our real calendar. It just means to say that because at that time the Jewish people were being forced to use the solar calendar, and the solar calendar came out, which is at that time of the year, is 8 days ahead. So it came out on the 9th of Tammuz. Now, another important point to mention, so the Maharsha mentions, by the way, that there's another problem here, because the Nevuah of Yirmiyah about the destruction, which is obviously about the first destruction, talks about the Makal Shokin Aniroya, about the destruction is coming very soon, like an almond. What's the connection to an almond? Because an almond, from when it blossoms until it produces fruit, is 21 days, which refer to the 21 days between the 17th and the 9th of right? 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av is what we call the 3 weeks. Now, if you say that the destruction happened on the 9th of Tammuz, then what happens to the 3 weeks, right? So therefore, you have to say that actually it was 3 weeks. It was only the 17th of Tammuz until because that would be another problem with Yerushalmi, right? And interestingly, there is a blatant contradiction in Rashi's commentary to Nach, because in Rashi's commentary to Yirmiyah, the first chapter of Yirmiyah, in the Pasuk Yud Beis 12, he says that Rashi explicitly translates this prophecy of Yirmiyah to be referring to the 21 days from the 17th of Tammuz, when the city was breached, until the 9th of Av, when the temple was destroyed, right? So, but then later on, when the pasuk itself says later on in Yirmiyah that the city was breached on the 9th of Tammuz, Rashi doesn't say anything. So what's going on over here? So clearly, according to Rashi, the two are not a contradiction. Rashi is perfectly comfortable with saying that the breach happened on the 17th of Tammuz and saying what happened on the 9th of Tammuz. So there's different ways to answer Rashi. You could say that the Rashi holds like the Maharsha, or alternatively, the Rabbi suggests, say, based on the Diak and the Psukim, that according to Rashi, there were 2 stages in the breach. There was the external wall and then the wall of the Beis HaMikdash, and or the Harabayas, and sort of those are the 2 walls being referred to. But again, according to Rashi, there's no contradiction between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. Both are true. And then finally, just to finish off with an important point. Oh, one second. I left out the Tashbitz. I mentioned before the Tashbitz. Okay, the Tashbitz also gets into this whole thing about why we're fasting for the 17th and on the 9th. But one thing that he says is that you see the Navi and Zechariah, we mentioned this last week, that the Navi and Zechariah refers to the fast by the month, not by the day. So he says the main thing is that you should fast in that month. So Mamela, yes, it's true. He says that in the first destruction it was on the 9th, and the second destruction was on the 17th. So you could say, oh, well, the first destruction is more important. We should be fasting on the 9th. But we're fasting in the same month, so it's fine. Doesn't matter. Now, the Tashbitz doesn't say this, but I think I alluded to this last week, that we saw last week this machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva, what the fast of Teves is. Rabbi Akiva holds it's the 10th of Teves when the city was besieged, and Rabbi Shimon holds it's the 5th of Teves when the report came to the diaspora. According to the Tashbitz, by fasting on Asara B'Teves, we're fulfilling both opinions. Because even according to Rabbi Shimon, that the fast is on the 5th of Teves, for when the news came to the diaspora, we still, at least to some extent, are fulfilling that, commemorating that Avelos by fasting on the 10th of Teves. Okay. Just to finish off with 2 more points quickly. First of all, the Magen Avraham says like this. This is a point made by the Rabbi. Look at the Sichos, volume Ches, page 309 at the bottom. It says like this. The Magen Avraham says that a Baal Nefesh should fast on the 9th of Teves as well. Sorry, on the 9th of Tammuz as well, because of the breach of the wall in the first Beis HaMikdash. And then it says, Mihu, however, Yerushalmi is that on Yerushalmi it says that the first destruction also, in the first place of English, it also happened on the 17th of Tammuz. So it sounds like he's saying, it sounds like initially he's saying, oh, if you're very pious, you should fast on the 9th of Tammuz. And he's saying, no, actually, you don't need to, because the Yerushalmi says it happened, both times happened on the 17th of Tammuz. So what do you mean? Like we always follow, when there's Machlokes Bavli and Yerushalmi, we always follow the Bavli. So the Rebbe says that based on all these different svaros that we mentioned, to synthesize between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, that actually everybody agrees that it happened on the 17th of Tammuz. It makes sense what the Magen Avraham means. He says, based on that Yerushalmi, you see that it didn't really happen on the 9th of Tammuz. There's a Kilkul Cheshbonos that happened on the 17th, and the Bavli also agrees to that, to that difference. And even if you're a Baal Nefesh, you could still have breakfast on the 9th of Tammuz.